in the first verse of chapter 3, it just says the word of Yahweh was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. And then we have this vision, this calling. And this is another beautiful story. Samuel is serving in the temple. Eli is older. His eyesight is failing. Samuel's lying down in the temple where the Ark of God was, and he hears his voice at night being called, Samuel, Samuel. And he gets up and he runs to Eli, believing that Eli's calling him, but it was not Eli calling him. And it happens again, and it happens again.
Reaching from way down here. From way down here.
Welcome to Thread, a podcast designed to explore God's story and lead you into a full life in Christ.
Thank you for joining us in this conversation, co-hosted by myself, Hannah D'Souza, and Dr. David Proctor.
Though I'm way down here, I get a better view of this boundless world that I'm going to.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Thread. We are in episode 31 today, and it's a new series that we are beginning. And the series is called God's People Blessed. And today's episode is on Hannah and Samuel.
Yay.
And I was actually named after this character in the Bible. My parents also like the name. And I know it's important to you too, Dave, because your daughter is called Hannah.
She is called Hannah. You know, Beth and I have always been inspired by this story, but we also like the name. So there was maybe some inspiration from this story. My grandmother was named Hannah. So it's a family name. We like the name. And so, yeah, I didn't know you were actually named after this story.
Yeah, I should have asked my parents more before starting the episode, but I do know that's where it came from.
And you're back someplace where you were in our early episodes.
I am. Yes, if anyone's observant, this is where we began the journey. But I'm back in London, and it's good to be home.
I am really excited about this episode because it's about Hannah and the namesakes. But really, what's so powerful about this episode that we're going to see is, maybe this is a strong statement, but it's almost like in this story, when the men in power couldn't get things right, we have these stories of women that turn this thing around. And that's a lot of what's going on in this story that we're going to see unfold here today. Oh, by the way, it's also exciting to be talking about God's people blessed. It feels like we've been in a period of time
yeah, I was thinking that. We've been in the wilderness for a while.
There's just been a lot of bad news and difficult things. And it's going to be good to just look at this kind of moment in Israel's history where things start turning the corner. So today really starts a shift in the meta-narrative. So even though Israel finally reached many, many years ago at this point, their cherished promised land, what we have seen is that they did not remain faithful to the covenant with Yahweh. They got what they wanted by reaching the promised land, but it did not change their behavior. And it required some really bad, not only decades, but centuries of struggle to wake Israel up. And, you know, I mean, out of the gate, we can identify that pain is the great teacher that really started bringing about that. That was the teacher throughout the book of Judges. They just didn't make a full turn. So we did see in the book of Judges this constant spiral. They would feel this pain of being oppressed by their enemies, and then they would ask for help, and God would send a judge. But we didn't see spiritual men leading covenant faithfulness back to Yahweh. So by the time we get to the end and we see how bad things were in Judges, we saw in this story of Ruth that even in the midst of tragedy and chaos, there are faithful people that Yahweh would work through to see his will done. And that's why that story of Ruth and Naomi were so powerful. We're now going to enter a time when Israel starts getting some things right, and we're going to see this kind of renewed covenant faithfulness and what it will ultimately lead to. So for those that are able to look at the chart, you know, to come back to this kind of picture of these sections of the story that we're moving through. We're now in this place, which I think is our 5th series called God's People Blessed. And we're going to now move into this space of the United Kingdom under King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. But all of that starts with these women that create this pivot. So where the story just ended, we just, in our last episode, talked about these 2 amazing women, Ruth and Naomi. Behind the scenes of this meta-narrative, this unfaithfulness of Israel, we have these remarkable people that stand out. They're spiritual. They're vastly different than the judges, right? That's part of what the story's showing us. If you look at Ruth and Naomi and now Hannah, you're going to see these different characters than we saw in Samson and, the other judges. So this next part of the story starts with the humble beginnings of a spiritual woman named Hannah. Now, there's another piece here that's important, that the narrative is being told from the margin. So a lot of times stories are not told from the margins. They're told from the central powers that be. And yet these stories are different. We saw that with Ruth and Naomi. We see that here. It's this kind of fundamental seismic shift of, okay, this is what's going on in the power structure, but now we have these people that are just good, faithful people, and they're going to be the ones that bring about change for Israel.
Yeah, I love this idea of kind of these stories from the margins being made central. And we ended the last series talking a bit, as you said, about this kind of spiritual void that was present in Israel in the time of the judges, that was kind of paving the way for a new type of leader, or there was a hope there for a new type of leader. And I think we get to see this in Samuel. But early on, beginning with his parents, I think what I have seen in the characters of Elkanah, who's Hannah's husband, and Hannah are people whose faith is not dependent on the institution or the kind of the religious structure of their time, thankfully so. We see in the beginning of the story Elkanah sacrificing to God year after year, regardless of the corruption of the priests, which will come. And I know we'll get into that later, but even Eli's sons are described as not knowing the Lord and being kind of corrupt in that way. And then again, we see Hannah turn to God in prayer, which is again something that we're going to spend some time on. And she's respectful to Eli despite his shortcomings, but also not deterred by him. When she's praying and he thinks she's drunk, she's still very respectful and says, "Not so, my Lord." But worship is definitely characteristic of their home, it seems, and we see references to them worshiping and sacrificing a few times throughout the story. And I think this will be a hopeful message for those that might find themselves in less than ideal faith communities. The convictions of Elkanah and Hannah and their faith in Yahweh are clearly their own, is a takeaway for me, at least from their story. And God sees them quietly following him in the margins, and I think that's why he chooses to weave them into this story, into his story.
Well, and for those that may not remember the details of this story, as you just said, so Elkanah comes and presents these sacrifices. He has 2 wives. He certainly seems to have more affection for Hannah, even though she's not able to have children. And his other wife has children. And as typical in these kind of cultures, and we see this before with Hagar and Sarah, this animosity that develops between these 2 women. And Hannah, in her faithfulness, just comes and presents herself at the temple and prays. And she offers this kind of sacrifice before she has the blessing, where if Yahweh will bring her a child, that she will devote the child to service of the temple. So she wants to have a child, and she's willing to give up the child if she has the child. So it's fascinating. So in this story, we see Yahweh, as Yahweh always does, finds and works through this humble and willing servant. And as we've noticed, these individuals are often born in adversity. So if we remember, Naomi and her husband ended up in Moab because of a famine. Now we have Hannah standing at the temple, pouring her soul out to Yahweh because she's barren and she can't have children. Now in this culture, and I know this sometimes is hard for us to get our heads around, but a woman's identity is very much bound up in their ability to have children.
Yeah, and I know this is a theme we've spoken about earlier in the podcast of kind of the barren woman or the barren matriarch. And we've seen it previously with Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel. And as you said, when we meet Hannah, we see this is a significant part of her story too. And actually, we're introduced to her by finding out about her barrenness. It says Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none at the beginning of kind of 1 Samuel 1. And even she's provoked by Peninnah for not having children. What's, I think, really interesting about Hannah is the way she approaches her barrenness is very different, actually, to the women we've encountered so far. Just to list a few, I think we saw with Sarah, her take matters into her own hands by telling Abraham to sleep with Hagar, who she's also not kind to Hagar. And then she laughs when she's told about the promise of Isaac. I think about Rachel. She was envious of Leah for having children, and then she even ends up turning to her husband and saying, "Give me children or I'll die," in Genesis. But with Hannah, her response is really characterized by prayer. And she's no less heartbroken than the other women, but she takes those emotions to a different place. And we'll see in 1 Samuel 1, in verse 10, it says, "In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly." And then in verse 15, and you've mentioned this, she says, "I was pouring out my soul to the Lord." I love that phrase. So you can tell, and we can even tell, I think there's a lot of faith in her prayer, because after kind of pouring out her soul to God, it says in the narrative that she leaves and her face was no longer downcast. And so I think Hannah is just an amazing example of how to handle disappointment, really, and where to take the emotions that disappointment brings.
There is something really profound in that from a spirituality perspective. There's, a lot of Christians, I even found myself in a conversation this week with one of our elders about this, that the way people process pain, they either typically try to ignore it, stuff it, move on, not think about it, or they get reactive, as you just articulated, right? With these other women in these previous stories, there's more of an sinful, reactive kind of situation to the pain. Instead of what is a spiritual response is to lean into the pain in God's presence and process the pain spiritually. And that's what brings you through it. And that's just such an incredible example here that she sets. So I appreciate you bringing that out. There's another piece that's at play in the story that ties into this, and it's this Nazarite vow. It was first mentioned in Numbers 6. I don't even know that we talked about it when we were back in the book of Numbers, but it was a way for men or women to separate themselves in service to Yahweh. Now, what's interesting about the three things that Yahweh says a Nazarite should do, if they're going to take a Nazarite vow, they should have no wine or strong drink or anything related to grapes in their life. Okay? No raisins, right? No
They're not missing out there.
No grape juice. Number 2, no razor should touch their head. And number 3, they were not allowed to be in proximity of a dead body, even if it was one of their relatives. So these are the 3 kind of qualifications. Now, we read about this in Numbers. The first person we see taking this Nazarite vow is Samson. And the second person that we see is here. And this vow will be, again, in stark contrast, almost like you're painting this picture of Hannah being different from the way other barren women. We actually see Samuel being different than Samson in this vow.
Yeah, it's interesting to see with Samson. I think I remember correctly, like his parents were told he would be a Nazarite and set apart from birth, or they ought to do that for him. So it seemed to be like a calling that's bestowed on you. And so am I correct in thinking that Hannah is the first to choose it? So it's not told to her by God. Yeah.
I mean, as far as the story goes, you're right. There's only those two examples that we see at this point in the story. It does get mentioned one other time later in the Old Testament, but these are two unique situations that tie into our story. So Hannah does become pregnant. She has a son. She raises him until he's ready to be weaned. And this typically in ancient Israel would have been between 2 and 3 years old. Hannah and Elkanah bring their son as an offering to Yahweh at the temple to serve in the temple, that he would spend his life there. And you see this language a lot of Hannah loaning him to the Lord, right? He's on loan to Yahweh. And this is what, one of the things I just love about this story is this beautiful prayer that comes as a result of this miraculous blessing. There's something really special here. So this is in 1 Samuel chapter 2. It's the beginning of this chapter, and it's this heartfelt reflection about a heart that really loves God. And this is why it's so special. This is a rare expression. We have not seen something like this since the days of Joshua, really, in the story. That's 350 years ago, right? There's this kind of spiritual understanding and spiritual depth and focus on a relationship, a covenantal faithfulness to Yahweh. So the last time we saw any kind of personal expression to Yahweh was another woman's song, Deborah. We talked about Deborah's song in, I think it was Judges 5. But that song was much more of a victory battle song, right? She'd won these big victories, and it's kind of this proclamation of victory. This is personal. This is intimate. Now, we don't have time to read the whole thing, but I selected about half of it. Hannah, if you could read for us some of these verses of Hannah's prayer.
In 1 Samuel 2, verse 1, it says, Hannah prayed and said, my heart exults in Yahweh. My strength is exalted in my God. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your victory. There is no holy one like Yahweh, no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. Yahweh makes poor and makes rich. He brings low, he also exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are Yahweh's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked will perish in darkness, for not by might does one prevail.
From you reading this, you quickly see the personal nature of this. It is deeply in her heart. This is a response of intimacy from someone who has a relationship with Yahweh. It's very profound.
A fun fact, when I was in my campus ministry or my student ministry in our church growing up, we all got hoodies and we could choose the name we would have on the back. And I chose this reference, so 2 Samuel 1, like the Hannah's prayer reference on my back. And I thought it was very clever because then people could look it up and find my name there, the Hannah's prayer. But I also really the prayer resonated with me too. I think that's also why I had it on my back. And I love that you mentioned kind of it's the first of its kind in a way, or since Joshua, that kind of personal expression of devotion and love, and it kind of foresees or preempts the Psalms. And again, even in this prayer, we see differences with the women that came before her. While there was clearly gratitude for the miraculous children that each of the women mentioned ended up bearing, for Hannah, she's the only one we see a public declaration of praise to Yahweh from. And in the narrative, she announces it first to Eli when she brings the weaned Samuel to him. And she reminds him, she says, I am the woman who stood by you here praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition, which I asked of him. So she's reminding him, like, this is the son I prayed for. But then again, we see that public declaration in this prayer. And I love that it's recorded in the narrative to kind of go down in history through the generations, this prayer. And it has a lot of features of Hebrew poetry actually in it. And And for me, it's amazing to see how much of it is praise. And it begins with this exaltation. And my translation says, "My heart rejoices in the Lord," which I think is such a powerful opening. Of course, she's not rejoicing in leaving her son. I think about previously we've read Abraham is called to give up his firstborn son, but Hannah, she does this voluntarily. And it must have been heartbreaking. And the Bible goes on to mention that every year she will return and bring a new robe for him, even long after she has other children, which I think is such a tender image of a mother's love. But we do see her in this prayer, like rejoicing in God's providence and his past, present, and even foreseeing future faithfulness. And I love that we're beginning kind of this series even with her, because I think so much of the leader that Samuel will end up being begins kind of in the faith of his mother. And I think that definitely stays with him.
Yep, absolutely. And we will see, as you just mentioned, that Yahweh will honor her and her sacrifice with having more children. So she's no longer barren. She'll have 3 sons, 2 daughters. And yet we still see that, as you say, that mother's love as she returns to the temple. So the story then shifts. Now we see this contrast with Eli, who is the current judge, and his sons. The narrative shifts to what's going on with them. They're named Hophni and Phinehas. The Bible actually calls them scoundrels. They were cheating the priestly system and taking the best cuts of meat for themselves from the sacrifices instead of offering them to Yahweh. They were sleeping with women who served at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And it just says in 1 Samuel 2:17, the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of Yahweh, for they treated the offerings of Yahweh with contempt. Now, their dad, Eli, the judge, does confront them, but he does not remove them from their spiritual leadership positions. And Yahweh condemns this. He shares with Eli that the sign of his disapproval will be that they will both die on the same day. And Yahweh then says in 1 Samuel 2, and Hannah, if you could read chapter 2, verse 35 here for us.
"I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. I will build him a sure house, and he shall go in and out before my anointed one forever."
We see this kind of beginning of God is going to choose, God is going to raise someone up who's faithful. This, again, covenant faithfulness that reflects God's heart, that reflects his mind, it says here. Now, there's another piece that's kind of in the background that becomes important before the story shifts, which is there's this kind of comment made in the first verse of chapter 3. It just says the word of Yahweh was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. And then we have this vision, this calling. And this is another beautiful story. Samuel is serving in the temple. Eli is older. His eyesight is failing. Samuel's lying down in the temple where the Ark of God was, and he hears his voice at night being called, "Samuel, Samuel." And he gets up and he runs to Eli, believing that Eli's calling him, but it was not Eli calling him. And it happens again, and it happens again. This third time, Eli realizes what's happening. He tells Samuel that Yahweh's speaking to him, and he says, next time you hear your name called, you need to respond directly to Yahweh. The scripture actually says in 1 Samuel 3:7, now Samuel did not yet know Yahweh, and the word of Yahweh had not yet been revealed to him. So here we have this boy, and it's kind of hard to figure out exactly how old he is, but he's old enough to have responsibilities in the temple. He'd been there for a while. Eli's getting older. We do know that boys in ancient Israel were typically considered adults around 13 years old. I would imagine that's around how old he is when this happens, because it says he did not yet know Yahweh. But from this moment on, it becomes this personal connection. And so that's all kind of in the background. And then we have this kind of shift in the story that you can tell us about next, Hannah.
Well, yeah, we've talked earlier I guess, throughout the podcast about this idea of Hineni, that Hebrew word meaning like here I am, and that being a posture of presence. And we talked about it with the calling of Abraham and that being his response to God. And again, it's a response we saw in the calling of Moses, which we talked about in episode 20. And I remember in that episode mentioning a quote from a Jewish commentator who describes Hineni as a readiness to receive and respond to whatever experience is about to unfold. And it's a posture of undiluted presence. I love that phrase. And I think it's interesting here that we see Samuel 3 times use that phrase with Eli, saying, here I am, here I am. And then, as you said, Eli directs him to Yahweh. And so we see that he's learnt this posture in his temple service and now is being taught to redirect this posture to Yahweh and redirect his humility and willingness to serve from Eli to now Yahweh. And that's something we get to see unfold in the story.
You know, it's really easy to miss the significance of what you just shared. That here we have this young man who has been trained to have this humility in the presence. I even like the way you talked about that with presence, to have this humble, engaged presence of here I am, and this readiness for whatever's given. And the only reason he was able to do that with Yahweh is he'd been trained to do that by Eli, right? I think that speaks volumes about the role of parenting and training children. And it's easy as parents to get really caught up in all kinds of things instead of teaching that heart of obedience, willingness, humility, to listen, to be present to authority. And I think that's really significant about what's happening here in the story. So I love the way the next part of this unfolds in 1 Samuel 3. Can you read, Hannah, verses 10 and 11?
Now Yahweh came and stood there, calling as before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, Speak, for your servant is listening. Then Yahweh said to Samuel, See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hear of it tingle. So epic.
It is. And the way this starts out, Yahweh came and stood there.
I can't even fathom what that must
that
have
mean?
been like.
Yahweh came and stood there.
Wow.
And calls Samuel, and he says, Speak, your servant is listening. That's what he was told to say from Eli. But then we move on to this kind of pronunciation, the first vision. I mean, okay, you just have to imagine this, right? The first vision that this young Samuel is about to receive is going to be condemnation for his mentor and his mentor's sons. So it says in the very next couple verses here in verse 13, For I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God and he did not restrain them. Can you imagine that as a 13-year-old boy?
No, I'm kind of amazed that God trusted him with that, to have the maturity to handle that message.
Right. And then, and you see this kind of trepidation then in Samuel with, what do I do with this message? And of course, Eli the next morning gets up and finds Samuel and insists that Samuel tells him exactly what did Yahweh say. And we see Samuel's character here, his forthright, authentic, truthful self, and he explains exactly what was said. And you do have to appreciate Eli's response here. Eli responds by saying, It is Yahweh, let him do what is good to him.
Wow.
This word, let him do what is good or seems good to him, is this Hebrew word tov. It's the same word that's used in Genesis 1 about when God saw what he'd created, it was good. So that's the spirit in which Eli's responding. If this is what seems good to Yahweh, let it be.
I think it's amazing in this narrative to see the ability to hold the tension of complex leaders Because we see, I mean, he's taught Samuel this posture. And this is kind of Samuel's beginnings of his relationship with Yahweh. He's learned that from Eli, but then at the same time, we see the corruption there too, that he's not perfect. And I think Samuel's learning at a young age how to hold that intention, I guess, the humanity of leadership.
Yeah, that's an absolutely great point. We move on in the story. If you could read 1 Samuel 3:19 and on for us, kind of frames what's going to happen next and how the story turns.
So it says, as Samuel grew up, Yahweh was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of Yahweh. Yahweh continued to appear at Shiloh, for Yahweh revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of Yahweh. And the word of Samuel came to all Israel. In those days, the Philistines mustered for war against Israel.
So now, in contrast to there being very few visions, now we have a spiritual man and we have visions of Yahweh that start regularly happening here, which is important. That's significant. We also see now this tension that arises with the Philistines. And this really, the next couple chapters plays out this story. The Philistines attack Israel. They capture the Ark of God and kill both of Eli's sons at the same time, as was prophesied by Samuel. Eli at this time was 98 years old. The Bible says he was a hefty man, which kind of matters because he falls over. When he hears the news about his son's death and the ark being captured, the Bible says he fell backwards, broke his neck, and died. And he had judged Israel for 40 years. So the Ark of God is now in the hands of the Philistines. It ends up in one city, and then they move it to another city and another city, because any city where this ark is, people start developing tumors and dying in these cities. So they're like, we don't want it, right? And they move it to another city. No, we don't want it. And they move it. And after 7 months of it being in multiple cities, the elders of the Philistines gather and they go, okay, we have got to send this back to Israel, but we need to send it back with an offering, a guilt offering, and try to appease this God that's bringing trouble upon us. So they craft in gold images of the tumors that they had been getting on their bodies. So we see 5 gold tumors and 5 gold mice representing the plagues that were coming upon them. So you get this image that wherever the ark was, these cities were also being infested by mice. So we have these kind of gold tumors and gold mice, 5 of each. And they chose 2 new cows that had never worn a yoke. They put the ark on the cart. They put these 10 now gold things as an offering and these 2 cows, and they send it off. And they basically, you do it as a test. Okay, if it goes back directly to Israel, that we know that this was, we had offended Israel's God. And if it doesn't, then we know we didn't. And of course, what happens? The cows walk directly to the field of Joshua of Shemish, which actually means the house of God. So in other words, the cows march directly to the house of God. And the Israelites rejoice and they sacrifice the cows. Sorry, what was that?
No, carrying the gold tumors. I still can't get that image out of my head.
Carrying the gold tumors. Yeah. So there you have it. So then we come to, nearing the end of this piece of the story, and we shift here. If you could read, Hannah, in 1 Samuel 7, verses 3 and 4, kind of some statements here about Samuel and what kind of leader he was.
Then Samuel said to all the house of Israel, if you are returning to Yahweh with all your heart, then put away the foreign gods and the Astartes from among you. Direct your heart to Yahweh and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. So Israel put away the Baals and the Astartes, and they served Yahweh only. Is that the name of a god?
I think it is. Yeah, I think it's the name of one of the local deities. It's yes. Okay. So this is unique. We haven't seen one of the Israel's judges do this before.
What makes it unique, I guess, this charge that Samuel gives to Israel?
So what we've seen with the judges so far is that the judges rescue Israel from the hands of the enemies, but we don't see them take the next step. He directs people to personally repent, to put away the foreign gods, and to serve Yahweh only. In fact, in the 350 years of the book of Judges that we've covered, over and over again, Israel does evil in the sight of Yahweh. They're serving Baal and other local deities. Yahweh's anger continues to be unleashed. And he allows the Philistines and the Ammonites to oppress Israel. Yahweh cries out. This happens over and over and again, but we only read in one part in all of Judges. It was in Judges 10:16. It says, so they put away their foreign gods among them and served Yahweh, and he could no longer bear to see Israel suffer. But we never had one of the judges take the repentance to that level before in our story. So that's powerful. Samuel's a new kind of judge. Samuel is not just there to lead Israel, he's there to lead Israel spiritually, and he does so by his own faithfulness. And if you can read this kind of last verse for us, Hannah, in chapter 7, verse 15.
Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He went on a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, and he judged Israel in all these places. Then he would come back to Ramah, for his home was there. He administered justice there to Israel and built there an altar to Yahweh.
This is a great kind of conclusion to today's episode, that we see Samuel as a new kind of judge. And as you said earlier, rooted in this spiritual kind of upbringing of his own mother's faithfulness, this covenant faithfulness now that's getting restored, that will now have influence on the people of Israel at a personal level, at a communal level, that really, it's not about Yahweh saving them from their oppressors. It's about Yahweh saving them so that they can return to him with all their hearts in this covenant faithfulness. And that's really been the heart of Yahweh the whole time. We finally start seeing that table turn.
Well, thank you for laying that foundation. Next week's episode, we're going to see the introduction of kings to Israel, which is not a welcome introduction, because we're going to be beginning with Saul and have that to look forward to.
We do have that to look forward to. So we'll be moving now into Saul and David and Solomon. And of course, this period of time is called the United Kingdom. And then we'll move on to the divided kingdom, and we'll see why that is in time. But as always, Hannah, it's great to talk with you. I know you'll be in London for our next few episodes, right?
Well,
so we will see you next time talking about Saul. Thank you for joining this Thread conversation.
We're more than a podcast. Check out threadpodcast.org for more immersive content.
Though I'm way down here, I get a better view of this boundless world.